sticks, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is my regular co-host, Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum, Jay Carson.
Morning, Mike.
Morning, Jay. How you doing?
I didn't have something prepared because I'm running the show today, so I didn't know I had to do that. So,
well, that's.
I didn't have my funny quip sort of that I'm trying to work on.
I can't say that I'm not disappointed, but I'm sure you'll have one next time.
Next time I will.
That's that. I'm going to hold.
Because I want to make them topical. You know what I mean?
No.
Like I don't want to write down a bunch of advance.
It's a lot of pressure. It really is. But I know you're up to it. Anyway, so since you are running the show, why don't you go ahead and
let's start running.
Yeah, let's do
it. Well, the interesting thing that happened this week, on Wednesday, Attorney General William Barr appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee to answer questions relating to his summary of the Mueller report and also his decisions regarding not to prosecute, I guess is the best word, President Trump for obstruction of justice. And on Friday, he didn't appear before the House Judiciary Committee to ask for the same questions. The difference being, one of the differences, and we'll talk about this, is that the House Democrats were insisting that they be allowed to have a staff person or an attorney question the Attorney General, which would be unusual, if not unprecedented. House Democrats are also demanding that Barr provide unrestricted access to the unredacted report, Mueller report, and if he doesn't do so, are going to hold him in contempt. This is, of course, his response, and it's a good one, I think, is that he's prohibited from doing that by the grand jury rules. And also, again, in this thing, which we'll talk about, which is sort of strange, Nancy Pelosi has accused Barr of lying to Congress, noting that is a crime. And there have been multiple calls for his resignation and or impeachment. So with all that, I guess, Mike, I'll ask your first question. You posted a little bit about this on Facebook last week. The Senate testimony and just this whole procedure of bringing in Barr to answer questions on a summary of a report that they now have. What's your impression of is this a substantive fact-finding mission, or is this just sort of politics?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's largely politics. I mean, it seems there are a couple things going on here, it seems to me, and that it seems to me pretty clear that Bob Barr's main focus, his main focus is to protect the president. I do agree with my colleagues on the left who say that he's acting much more like the personal defense attorney of the president than he is as the attorney general. Now,
well, how so exactly?
Well, I think, number one, the very fact that he put out a summary report that was clearly a major exercise in spin to try to set the narrative. There was no need to do that whatsoever. He could have just let the report speak for itself.
Democrats were demanding the report.
Well, people demand a lot of things, but I think it was, it would have been a reasonable thing to say. It's like, this is 448 pages. I'm not going to try to summarize it. Therefore, I'll get the report out as quickly as I can and let it speak for itself. He chose not to do that. And I think he chose not to do that because he did want to, in fact, influence the narrative. Now, I want to say that I gave Barr the benefit of the doubt. I think that's important, that we should always start by assuming that people are acting in good faith. But really what he's done to this point has convinced me otherwise. And I guess it's not too surprising, because when I think about it, what sort of person would take on the job of Attorney General to a corrupt president who has no real respect for the rule of law? I mean, I almost give Jeff Sessions a pass, or at least half a pass. And you know how I feel about Jeff. Well, yeah, on policy. But okay, when he signed on, it was maybe less entirely clear how sort of deep the rot in Trump world went. or at least maybe he could have convinced himself this way. But Barr knew exactly what he was getting into. And why would he get into it? Well, I wanted to believe that he was a better person than he is, in part because of his kind of fairly good, establishment pedigree and so forth. But I believe he's proven that he's a partisan hack interested in just protecting the president at all costs. And it's really kind of sad, I think, because to this point he had a really good reputation, and I think he's just destroying it for this reprehensible man. That's really too bad.
Oh, well, I disagree on a whole lot of things. And,
Okay.
And I guess my first of all is sort of take the Socratic approach, and I'm still not saying what exactly has Barr done that is in any way reprehensible. And again, there are a lot of things that he's done that would seem to be at odds with a plan to just spin this. For example, he offered the summary to Mueller to review before he released it, and Mueller said, "Well, no thanks." I mean, that would seem to be if he was going to misrepresent conclusions, which was what he's accused of doing. That would seem to be a strange thing to do. It would also be if he was going to misrepresent what's in the report, a strange thing to do to provide it with very limited redactions, and and within 3 weeks. I mean, I think which was the time frame he said he would provide it. And I guess fourth, I'm not sure what, if any, conclusions in the summary are incorrect. Is anyone saying that Barr's summary does not match up with what the Mueller report says? And you can say spin. Well, maybe he should have spun it to be more adverse to the president. Well, I suppose he could have. But to some extent, there's only so much you can do. Where if the special counsel says, I find no grounds for any collusion or nothing that could you prosecute her to go forward, there's only so much you can do. And I would also think that when it comes to the obstruction, it would be, passing strange. It would be the most bizarre. An attorney general bringing charges, indicting a sitting president, which has never been done and is constitutionally probably can't be done, based on a non-finding. I guess I'm still sort of at a loss of what this exercise is over. In that, if the Democrats have the report and they didn't like how Barr spun it, well, okay. I mean, then they can spin it how they want. They've got it now.
Well, sure. And in the sense, I agree with you in that I don't think that Barr did anything illegal. I wouldn't even go so far as to agree with Speaker Pelosi that he lied to Congress. But I mean, I think he's acting not as sort of a attorney general who's, should be focused on the impartial administration of justice. He's acting as a defender of the president, and that's his prerogative. So I think I find him not reprehensible. To be clear, I find Trump reprehensible, but Barr disappointing. And maybe I was a little naive to expect, again, that he would be anything but disappointing, given the fact that he was willing to work for this reprehensible man. So I just want to be clear on that. And so, I don't expect anything substantive to come out of this. I don't think he was chicken for not agreeing to talk to the House. It's just he wanted the terms of the engagement to be as favorable as possible. And certainly, when a partisan on your side controls the gavel and controls the hearings, then it's a lot more favorable to you. And he didn't want to go into a very kind of hostile environment, and that's his prerogative. And then Congress can go ahead and take the next step and subpoena him, and there can potentially be contempt charges and that sort of thing if it gets to that point. But in the end, I think this is just part, and we'll talk about this maybe, if not later on this show, at some point in the very near future, about just the general, I believe, Trump administration's view that Congress can be ignored as a co-equal branch of government, and that their oversight, they can just kind of ignore their oversight authority, and then there aren't going to be any consequences. And I think that there are, and there should be.
Well, let me ask you this, because first of all, I would say, you would agree with me. I don't think, at least I'm not aware of any historical example where a cabinet member has been called before Congress to be questioned by
Yeah, there have been.
a staff.
There
Okay,
have actually been a couple. There was, I think, one or two in the Nixon administration and one, I believe, in the Clinton administration. So it is unusual, but it
Again,
is
I'm
not.
talking a cabinet level
Yeah,
secretary of something. Yeah.
Yep. And it is unusual, but it is not unprecedented. It has happened with cabinet level officials at least twice, and I believe 3 times within our lifetimes, at least, Jay.
Okay.
But it is unusual. Well,
then,
so,
then I guess my question is, well, why would this fit into that unusual circumstance, right?
Well,
why would you need a staff person to conduct the questioning when what you're complaining about is you didn't like the summary of the report that you have, and you have the report now?
Well, and I think I would disagree with or I would challenge this framing of the question. Congress, the congressional committees have the right to design questioning however they want. If they want to bring in you or me to ask questions for 2 hours to someone, they can set up the format that way. And certainly the witness, the person who's being called, if it's voluntary, they're free to say, no, I don't want to do that. And then Congress, again, is free to subpoena them and, so forth and so on. But this idea that the witness is the person who gets to decide the terms of the questioning is just completely wrongheaded and frankly ridiculous.
I would say, no, it's not. I mean, if we're talking about co-equal branches, I would disagree. I would think there ought to be some respect for a co-equal branch, that you're not treating someone like a criminal defendant because you didn't like the summary.
Well, no, I mean, you don't get to tell Congress how it gets to do its oversight. That's what co-equal means. So in its own sphere, I
guess I'm not sure with the oversight portion. I mean, which article are you finding that in the Constitution that they can just call in? They have general oversight.
Yeah,
powers,
and there's
subpoena powers.
Yeah, and there's plenty of there's tons of Supreme Court precedent that says that congressional oversight is extremely broad, and it basically relates to anything that Congress can legislate or act on, which means that in this case there's so much. For instance, Congress can investigate the president, has impeachment authority, and there's no legal question here. Congress can conduct oversight on just about anything. This squarely fits into that. So anyone who's arguing that this doesn't fit into that, I think that's just a red herring. It's a non-issue. It's just, again, Barr didn't want to be questioned in a hostile environment, and I get that, but and so I guess I'm not disagreeing with you in the sense on the substance. Yeah, Barr spun, and I think he shouldn't have spun this, but you're right. The report's out, and with most of it unredacted. So in that substantive way, yeah. But to me, the broader question is, and this just general attitude that, Congress is this sort of lesser branch that we as the executive branch can sort of ignore with impunity or try to dictate terms to. And that's just not how the system's set up.
So, all right, I'll take the other side of this and argue that I think there's also something to be said, because in a lot of these contests, these inter branch shoving contest, right? It doesn't come down to a legal determination.
Right.
Courts are very reluctant to ever get into that. They say, look, this is a political thing. and the remedy is eventually at the ballot box. My sense is that Barr is pushing back on this, saying, look, no, I'll appear, but I'm not going to jump through your silly hoops. And I would point to, look, I mean, the requirement that Chairman Nadler has also said that he's demanding the unredacted report. And I think when we talked about this a couple weeks ago, there's plainly stuff in there that Barr cannot legally provide. And right. Nadler knows that. Yeah. And that is a completely frivolous demand. It's a frivolous attack on Barr's character. And I'm gonna put on my partisan hat, and probably everyone will be angry and inflamed, but this is an attempt to smear Bill Barr as his other investigation continues as to how this dossier came about and how the Justice Department and apparently now intelligence efforts overseas were geared against the Trump campaign. And I think this is not a conspiracy theory at this point, but
It sure sounds
if,
that
if
way.
you well, and let me also point it this way. I mean, so much of to me looking at politics is look at not what people say, but what they do. Um, the Senate Democrats really pretty much had free reign in questioning Barr, right? I don't think there was any time where the chairman reined them in and said, "I'm not going to let you answer or ask that question" and so forth. And it went on for 5 hours. Um,
Yeah, but
so I mean, I would
let me respond to that because I think this comes to, and this is something I also mentioned on the Facebook group this week. The issue of the format, right? I mean, the standard format, and maybe you and I have some common ground on this. I don't know, but this standard format of these 5-minute back and forth segments, one party, the other party, that's a horrible way to get at the truth of anything. I mean, that's not the way you would
sure.
question somebody if you wanted to dig deeply and really get some information and follow up and that sort of thing. And so, and again, this is just standard practice. So this isn't really a partisan issue. This is, well, what's the point of congressional hearings? For the most part, I would argue the point is partisan posturing. And that's,
I agreed 100%.
And so I think in this sense, you can make a good substantive case for changing that approach, although there are clear political reasons why you have that approach, because both parties want the chance to do that. And they don't necessarily think anything worthwhile anything big is going to come out of that, except for some sort of soundbite, basically. And so I think on that deeper level, you and I agree that a lot of this is political theater. And
it's a show. Yeah.
And on the substance, there's not a lot necessarily here. Now, you mentioned,
and I guess that's sort of my point is on the substance. What is there to find out or discover?
Yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot. I don't think that there's going to be a whole lot to discover from Barr specifically, because he's a smart guy and he's not, he's very much not like Donald Trump, and he's not going to let careless things slip. He's going to be very careful in his answers. He chooses his words very carefully to make a certain impact. He understands how that works. I mean, the guy's he hasn't been Attorney General twice for nothing. And so when he uses a word like, for instance, spying, he knows the impact that's going to have, So he's a partisan hack, but he's a very smart partisan hack. And so, now if you could get President Trump there for half an hour of some intensive questioning, now there might be some interesting things that would come out, but not
all right, which that brings me back to my point, which was, this is why you shouldn't let me run the show. Because, again, this Socratic sort of dialogue. If they don't expect to get any actual information out of Barr, there is no real information as to why did the summary say this instead of that, because all this information is out in front. They know they're not going to get the redactions because they know it's illegal. They know Barr cannot provide it to them by law, and he said that. And he said, "Look, if you want to, you can go ask the judge." Then why go through this exercise if not to smear him?
Well, I think there's a couple ways of looking at it. It's not necessarily smearing him, but it's certainly a big part of it is scoring political points, obviously, and if you want to kind of use the language of smearing. And again, I think that it's not so much, I don't see what I'm saying, for instance, as smearing Barr. I'm just saying, well, I'm calling.
Maybe smearing is a bad word. Maybe discrediting.
Okay, yeah, and I think let's use that word. I think that's a more neutral word, and I think it's fair because I think what he has been doing is discreditable. And so sometimes you just call a spade and say, well, okay, this is how this man is acting, and so there you go. And I think what he has done has been, I wouldn't go so far as to say contemptible. And of course, there are always these ridiculous calls to resign and that sort of thing. And both sides do that. But I don't think he's acting the way I would expect a kind of upright, honorable attorney general to act. And again, I bring in Jeff Sessions, and I hate to do this, but at least, in recusing himself from the investigation, Jeff Sessions acted, I believe, as an upright and honorable attorney general, which totally pissed off Donald Trump. And then, of course, he had Whitaker, who was just an acting guy who couldn't do a whole lot necessarily. But now he's got his guy. His guy is willing to carry water for him. And I don't believe that should be the job of the attorney general. And so I'm willing to call that discreditable.
Okay. I'm still at a loss as to what water he's carrying, but we can talk about that some other time. But
let me mention more on the substance. in his testimony to the to the Senate, if I understand Barr's view correctly on this, in the comments, his view seems to be that it's okay for a president to attempt to obstruct justice if the president believes he didn't do anything wrong. And I just found that to be a stunning legal theory, saying, well, it's, I don't think I did anything wrong, so I can end this investigation. And I just found that to be staggering. And I found, when I talk about what's discreditable, I think Barr knows that is a bogus legal theory, but he's just throwing anything out there he possibly can to protect the president.
For sure, I don't agree that that's a bogus legal theory. As it's stated, I think it is. I think if the idea is just that the president can, but we've talked about this before, that the president would have absolute statutory authority to dismiss Mueller at any time, right?
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's a very tough argument to make that says the statute allows you to fire this guy at any time for any reason. And then if you think about firing him, that's obstruction of justice.
Well, except, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the legal argument.
I partially agree with you, but I think you would probably agree that while the president has the right to, these people serve at the pleasure of the president, also it is possible for a president to obstruct justice. Now, we can't, it's difficult.
I would agree with you there, yeah.
So it's difficult to get into the president's mind, thank God, but any president's mind. But if we somehow knew, if we had some clear evidence that the president's reason for taking that action, firing whomever, was to obstruct justice, then that would not be difficult. The problem is legally demonstrating that. Yes?
No, I still.
So you
yes
think
and no.
that,
I think there's a difference between also what we're talking about with for example, if a president there's an investigation underway, a president seeks to, say, coerce a witness by providing that witness with a job at, let's say, Revlon. That would, I think, amount to obstruction of justice. You're trying to corrupt a witness. You're trying to tamper with testimony.
So, for instance, if Donald Trump tells McGahn, his personal or his attorney, to lie about something to investigators, that would be obstruction of justice?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it would be. Yeah.
Okay.
But if you're going to say, I am choosing to fire this guy who I'm statutorily entitled to fire, I don't think that gets to be obstruction of justice.
So even if, let me give you a very bright line type of example, I guess, or extreme example. So if Donald Trump, say, tweeted, I don't want Comey to investigate this anymore. I think it's bogus. I'm going to fire him. That wouldn't be obstruction.
Correct. Provided that Trump himself is not the target, which he never was. Now, again, that's a place where courts have never really ruled, and I think you've got some questions there of, look, can there be obstruction of justice if the president can't be indicted? Right. Well,
the president. There's no law saying the president can't be indicted. That's just a Justice Department, policy.
Well,
there's no law that says the president can't be indicted.
It's a policy because the Justice Department believes that if it went to court, well, first of all, it would be one of these things that's probably just disastrous for the nation all around.
Absolutely.
Right? But also, I think there's a policy of going to court that does that offend the co-equal branches and is the only, there's a school of thought, and I'm one of the people who adhere to it, that your remedy against a bad president is impeachment, and that is the sole remedy that's provided in the Constitution.
That is the only remedy provided in the Constitution. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, there was one other thing I wanted to mention, Jay, is that, there's a lot of talk about potentially holding Barr in contempt and so forth. And I want to just kind of bring this up a little bit to say, this isn't incredibly uncommon. For instance, attorney generals are held in contempt all the time. Well, not all the time, but Janet Reno, who was attorney general under Bill Clinton, was held in contempt by Republicans, and Eric Holder was held in contempt over, that's Obama's attorney general, over the Fast and Furious documents. But what's interesting about this is there are some people say, well, what happens when you're held in contempt? That sounds like it's a bad thing. And it seems to me that this is actually, from a tactical standpoint, is a smart strategy on the part of these attorney generals, and in this case, obviously, Barr, because it's very easy for them to hold out until after 2020. Because when the Congress holds you in contempt, they have basically three options. Number one is they can direct the sergeant at arms to put you in jail, basically, and that's not going to happen.
Which is not really going to happen.
Yeah, no, that's not a live option in that sense. The things would have to get a lot worse. But secondly, they can take the case to a U.S. attorney and ask the U.S. attorney to prosecute, and no U.S. attorney is going to prosecute the attorney general. Which would
then get forwarded up to Bill Barr's desk.
Yeah, exactly. So option two is off. So the only other option is to get the federal courts to order an appearance or to turn over documents, that sort of thing. And that actually can happen, but it takes a long time. Like in Fast and Furious, it took that case of contempt was because
the scandal, not the movie. Yes,
exactly. That Holder wasn't turning over some documents, and eventually the courts ruled that he needed to, but that was 4 years later. And at that point, it was, so this is from a strategy standpoint, it makes sense because the contempt power, I won't say is toothless, but it's not like when you're held in contempt of court, if like you or I went before a judge, and there could be some pretty significant penalties for that. Contempt of Congress is, again, you can't just totally ignore it necessarily, but it's not nearly as serious as being held in contempt of like a court, basically.
Right. And no, that's sort of exactly also the point. If you consider the Nadler demand for the unredacted report, which, as I understand, there is a manner they can see some of it almost unredacted, that it's available for review, but you have to go and sign in and so forth. And no House Democrats have done that. They have not taken that opportunity. They would rather have the unredacted posted online or something. But no, that's exactly the thing. Of Barr would have the choice of being held in contempt of court or held in contempt of Congress, and he's wisely will choose held in contempt of Congress.
Yeah.
So, all right, well, moving on, because I had a lot more stuff to say on other stuff, but we'll get to that some other time. But it's more a policy issue. The Trump administration has recently proposed tightening regulations relating to asylum. And what he's done is requested an extra $5.4 billion to provide things such as additional hearing officers to expedite the proceedings, and also his limited access to work permits to folks who have either been granted asylum or granted a non-removal, say that the asylum is still pending, but they're not going to be removed immediately. It is also proposed seeking fees for filing an asylum claim. Now, all of this was put together in a memo that went to the Justice Department, but as we said, Attorney General Barr has been otherwise occupied.
Yeah.
So there hasn't been any action on this. But this would all be something that the president would seek to do through his executive authority. And I'm wondering, because you will probably be of two minds on this, because on the one hand, I think you and I agree that the current asylum system is pretty broken.
Yeah.
But also, I think both of us tend to be leery of actions by executive order. So what are your thoughts on where this goes? And also, I guess the other piece is, should this become policy and be enacted, it would almost certainly be challenged in the courts, and then we're down that road again.
Yeah.
So,
well, I guess there are two parts. The first part is the that $4.5 billion emergency request, and maybe we can get to that in a minute. But
did I say 5.4?
Yeah, 4.5. Well, I mean, what's
around?
What's 900 million or so here or there? But the two separate things I would say. But focusing on the thing you mentioned, the executive order. Now, part of that, of course, he ordered that all of these claims should be adjudicated in 180 days. Now that actually isn't a change from current law. He just basically said, hey, the law should be followed here.
Right.
But if you do the math on this, which I decided to do, if you have a backlog of 850,000 cases, and it's a little more than that, but let's just use that number, and you have around 400 immigration judges, that's 11.8 cases per day, every single day, including weekends and holidays, to get all of them cleared in 180 days. Now, obviously, that's totally impossible, right?
And that also doesn't include the fact that we've got probably another 50,000 a month coming in.
Yeah, I mean they're pouring in. So yeah, that I think is, saying, hey, it would be nice if we could do this. Now, the administration is trying to hire more immigration judges, and I give them credit for that. And of course, Jeff Sessions did the same thing. Now, the president's latest budget, which he submitted in, I think it was February or March, was $71.1 million to hire 100 more immigration judges and the staff to support them. But of course, even if that's passed, that wouldn't be enacted until October, basically. Yeah. And so it seems to me that what I would have liked to see, just for the
emergency... And those judges then all have to be confirmed.
Well,
or do they?
No,
I don't know.
No, because they're immigration judges. That's not part of judicial. Yeah, that's totally under the Attorney General. So yeah, it's a pretty streamlined process, basically. What I would have liked to have seen, I like the fact that in this emergency request that there was, an understanding there's a lot of money needs to be set aside for humanitarian assistance, and most of that actually is for that, because it turns out it costs a lot of money to house minors, particularly the adults. They can kind of put them in very Spartan surroundings, but that doesn't work for the kids. And, that gets very expensive. But I would have really liked to have seen, because I think this is a big part of the reason why this is an emergency, is say if they would have asked, say, for $320 million to double the number of immigration judges, which I think that's around what it would have cost. I think that would have been something I think would have been really useful to do to kind of help break up that backlog, because, when you talked about the work permit thing, right? Not allowing work permits. I get the reasoning behind that, right? Because saying, well, if you don't allow the work permits, then people are going to be less likely to come. But I don't think that's how it works. I think what's going to happen, I'm fairly certain of what's going to happen, is then people come into the country and they need to work. They're waiting 2-3 years, maybe.
They'll work illegally.
Exactly. And so that pushes them underground and makes them even harder to, track within the system. That's exactly the kind of unintended consequence that we don't want. So I think it sounds good, but it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I'll also point out that it's kind of inconsistent in a way, because there's no push on the other side. I would like to see a call for mandatory 50-state E-Verify and more inspections. And in fact, when you look at the latest Trump budget, it calls for an 8% cut to E-Verify. So, I think that's kind of inconsistent, certainly. The other part of that you mentioned was imposing fees on asylum seekers. And again, I get the reasoning behind this, because certainly the administration's claim, and I think it's a reasonable claim, is that people are claiming asylum and, 70-80% of them don't have legitimate claims under asylum law. That's not saying that the conditions in their countries aren't, really bad, but it doesn't meet the legal qualification for asylum. But by imposing fees, of course,
which we should, because we throw this around and we don't always express it, but yeah, the legal justification for asylum would be that you are being persecuted for your political, religious beliefs. You are in danger.
Yeah.
From the regime, essentially.
And not that, your government is horribly corrupt and your life is awful, basically. And, that's certainly the case. But maybe you'll agree with this. The problem, if you did that sort of fee imposition across the board, is that catches up people who do have legitimate asylum claims. And you don't want to, the whole point of asylum law is to, help these people out who are in this danger. And so by making it more difficult for them, that's the tricky part of it.
Although I would point out there is, and I because again, all we have is this memo. We don't really have a fleshed out policy. But typically in any sort of judicial proceeding where there's a fee required, there's also usually a procedure where you can get that fee waived or deferred.
Right. That would be an important part of that.
There would probably be some discretion at some point to say, look, either they don't have the fee or they can be deferred for later payment or something like that. But again, that's this, what this was just sort of a broad outline and wouldn't get into those details. But
yeah. But I mean, would you agree with me that a big part of the problem, maybe one of the biggest parts of the problem, is that we just can't clear this backlog quickly enough?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So then you'd be in favor of trying to, at least temporarily for the next whatever, until we can clear this, to beef up the immigration judge, ranks.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd like to apply.
Yeah, there you go.
I figured, especially for, if I could do like a part-time, like a, November through March.
Yeah.
Part-time, because it would be somewhere nice and warm, right? I'd go to Southern California or Texas or something like that for 6 months out of the year and happily help clear the backlog.
Yeah. Well, and what do you think on the other point I was wanting to get your thoughts on, the E-Verify side of it? I've kind of been beating the drums for this for a while, right. But I mean,
no, and I'm actually, I think we talked about this maybe a year or so ago, and I think I'm generally on board. I think E-Verify is a good thing, and I think government efforts to enforce immigration law against businesses that benefit from illegal labor, I think that's entirely appropriate, and we ought to have that.
Yeah.
I think you and I differed maybe sometimes on the efficacy of the E-Verify program and whether it ought to be mandatory as a matter of federal law. But I don't in principle oppose it.
So I mean, basically, we're really largely in agreement on immigration here, which is nice every once in a while. So that must mean we're right. I mean, obviously,
I would think so.
Yeah. So. All right. Well, what do we have next, Jay?
So we're turning to a little further south, as the show often continues to go south.
Yeah, exactly.
Turn to Venezuela. Events in Venezuela. Opposition leader, and I'm not sure whether we call him opposition leader. I call him president.
Yeah, me too.
Juan Guaido had called for the military to defect essentially last week. The result was some skirmishes here and there, and what was, I don't know whether you call it an attempted coup, attempted civil war, whatever. But to ask Maduro, and there seemed to be for a time discussions that looked like Maduro might be willing to step down and might be willing to leave, but he changed his mind, all which then pushes it back on the U.S. As to what do we do about this. Now, U.S. officials have stated that all options are on the table. Now, of course, that's something that you always say.
Yeah, it's a real standard sort of thing.
Well, some of the options are on the table.
Yeah, because we're not going to do that. That's for sure.
Yeah. But there is sort of and Republicans, I would say, are in lockstep support behind the administration. Democrats less so. There's a bit of a schism there where you have some like Representative Ilhan Omar, and I just have to this quote because apparently immune to irony, is claiming is supporting Maduro on the basis that the legislature cannot seize power from the president. That's Ilhan Omar on the legislature cannot seize power from the president. One more time. But cooler heads like Joe Biden have come out to say that they support Guaido as the constitutionally elected, and when I say elected by the legislature, president of Venezuela, as have the vast majority of the world, with the exception of the usual suspects, Russia, China, and Cuba. So I guess this presents sort of the first test of the Monroe Doctrine in quite a while, as to what steps the U.S. ought to take here. So Mike, where do you fall on that in that continuum between Ilhan Omar and Joe Biden?
Well, especially given our incredibly fraught history of intervention in Central and South America, I think that any sort of military action would be highly, highly inadvisable. Now, of course, that puts me in odds with John Bolton, who seems to never saw a war he didn't want to get involved in. And I guess in this way, it kind of puts me in line, weirdly, with Donald Trump, who's he likes the fact that, and Bolton is his national security advisor, longtime nut, just current national security advisor, who, is very much, he likes his hawkishness, but doesn't actually want to get involved in wars. And I think in this case, maybe the president's instincts are correct in that this would be a bad idea. We have there seems to be a fair amount of unified support in a lot of the countries, leadership in the area that Maduro is not legitimate, and where our approach seems to be, in line with what the other countries seem to agree makes sense. And so I think by getting militarily involved, we just kind of put ourselves in a really bad situation, and getting involved in other people's, whether you want to call it civil war, but certainly internal ruling conflict, that rarely ends well. So I think we do what we can to try to provide humanitarian aid. I think another thing we can potentially do, and maybe it's quite possible we're doing this through back channels, we wouldn't necessarily be advertising it, is to try to provide some sort of carrots to, say, for instance, that if there is a new, more democratic regime that's actually in power, then we'd be willing to commit significant resources to kind of help them rebuild their democratic structures, rule of law. I mean, because Venezuela has been a mess for a long time now. Zach, who was on the show a while back, would totally disagree with me, but really since Chavez took over, the place has kind of just gone downhill pretty significantly. And so this country needs a lot of help, and we are in a position to provide that. And I think they could use that help. And so that would be maybe a carrot. But, it's a difficult situation, right, Jay? Because trying to convince these people to leave power when they think they're going to get prosecuted, as they should, because, for doing
not prosecuted, executed.
Execute. Well, yeah.
I think that's,
So it puts you in a difficult position because, of course, then when you do that, then you're basically encouraging other people to say, hey, listen, we can just take over this country and do awful things and then get a golden parachute. Isn't that a great deal? So it's the same reason you don't negotiate with terrorists, right? So yeah. And then there's the whole oil issue involved. Of course, Venezuela has the world's largest proven reserves of oil, and that certainly factors into a lot of these decisions. So it's a tough situation. I don't think we really have much we can do. Oftentimes in terms of foreign policy, we think, well, we should do something. And sometimes I think, well, the best thing to do is to maybe not do so much, to kind of stand back and try to be supportive when we can to help people in need. But just sometimes you have to let these other countries work out their own problems and not get so directly involved. And I know John Bolton doesn't believe that, but I do.
Here's the way I look at it. And I think maybe sometimes you, I don't want to say you miss the nuances, Mike, because I know you're all about nuance, but to me, I think maybe the Bolton Trump there's sort of a good cop, bad cop dynamic going on there.
Yeah.
Where, if I'm the president, again, John Bolton, you may not like him, but again, like Bill Barr, he's somebody who's been around for quite a while.
Oh yeah.
In the national security, diplomatic, milieu. And look, he would choose his words wisely. He knows what he's saying. So I think there may be a, that sort of sense of you just don't know what we're going to do, and all options are on the table, and so forth. And part of that has to be geared towards preventing either Cuban and or Russian adventurism in Venezuela, because I think that's the real significant risk we're looking at. And I think you're correct in terms of, listen, if this is a internal power dispute, and Venezuelans will eventually decide this to the extent they already haven't through their constitutional process. But all the other neighboring countries, most of the world, recognizes Guaido as the legitimate leader. That eventually Maduro will lose power and will have some sort of retirement, whether in Havana or on the Ural Sea or something. But but what do we do? What's the step if the Cubans or the Russians say we're going to send troops or military advisors to support the Maduro military? Because that's sort of a different animal there, right? I mean, that is, we're getting into this Monroe Doctrine territory of, and
yes
then you
and
can
no.
say what you.
I would say yes and no in that I see what you're saying, and I think it's a valid point. But at some point, if you see a hostile foreign power getting itself involved in a situation that's likely to just be disastrous, you just say, well, hey, go ahead, brother, have at it, and so sometimes the best thing to do is let them step in it. And because this is, I mean, so
But in what way would they step in it though? I mean, here's the thing: if and let's be blunt, if Maduro controls the military or significant portions of it, because a lot of the military finds itself in the same situation. If this isn't just an election of, gosh, we'd rather this guy doesn't win. If they win, they likely face imprisonment or execution. So what do you do? I mean, if one side has all the guns and the other doesn't.
Well, I mean, having all the guns that certainly helps you in the short term, but it doesn't matter how many guns Russia sends there. Venezuela's economy and political system is a complete disaster. That's not going to change the structural problems that are causing Venezuela to just be in the state that it's in. And so,
right. The people with the guns don't particularly care about that state.
Right,
and if you don't have the guns, there's nothing you can do about it.
Right, but I'm saying the people in the country obviously care about that state, and so if we want, I mean, I guess you could, if you're making a humanitarian case, saying that, well, people are suffering, and so therefore we should step in, but that's pretty clearly never been the basis of our foreign policy, because if that's the case, then we need to be giving hundreds of billions of dollars to Africa and other parts of the world.
If you look at, I think we did step in Somalia. We stepped in the Balkan wars. We stepped in Haiti. I mean, there are a lot of examples of humanitarian places we stepped in. And even if you wanted to be completely Machiavellian, sort of Kissingerian about this, you would say, look, even if not for humanitarian reasons, the outflow of people would tend to destabilize those other countries around it. And, we're talking about border problems. Well, that would be a whole other big one if you would have, a lot of people seeking to flee Venezuela.
Yeah, and certainly there are a lot of people seeking to flee Venezuela. So, I mean, I'm not unsympathetic to your view, but I guess I tend to, especially when it comes to Central and South America, to be much more inclined to be cautious of U.S. military involvement, because we have overstepped so often for so long in this case, and I think we've done much more harm than good in many instances. And Cuba would be just one of many examples. I would say, I think that I would argue that the fact that we have a communist regime in Cuba is the direct result of decades of U.S. interference and unlawful activities in Cuba, prior to the Castro regime. And we made that happen. And I think we need to be very careful about not repeating those sort of mistakes.
Well, I mean, okay. I guess my last thought on that is, I forgot my last thought.
Sometimes that happens, I just talk through it,
really good to say, and then I sort of, no, but, I mean, wouldn't you agree though that to some extent the U.S. has to be able to threaten? Military, whether or not it's wise to eventually use it, and certainly it is ought to be a last resort. As AOC helpfully stated last week when she was asked about the situation, she responded, "Violence is horrible."
I mean,
we would all agree that yes, violence is horrible, but don't we need to send that signal to the Cubans and or the Russians that we stand ready to move if we need to?
Sure, and I don't think you and I mean, we're kind of focusing on our points of difference here, but I think it's more a question of degree here. And certainly, I would have a real problem if Russia or Cuba just sent in massive military force, and so it's a question of how much are we willing to tolerate. But I think you would also agree that we have to give a certain amount of deference, and it's really easy. And this is maybe the Burkean in me coming out.
So you'd be okay with like a little bit of Russian?
Well, yeah,
support?
Absolutely. I think we need to be
Russian Facebook posts in favor of Maduro.
Well, we need to be we need to be judicious in here. We can't just be jumping into every internal battle everywhere that we see Russia jumping into as well, is I guess what I'm saying.
Okay. So a measured response.
Measured response.
Proportionate
I'm a big,
response.
but and again, as I was saying, the kind of Berkey in me just says that we tend to jump into these things and there are these unanticipated consequences, right? And whether it's this or whether it's like, well, why don't we bring democracy to the Middle East? Oh, sure. What could go wrong? Let's try that, right? And now we have a situation that's so far worse than what it was before. Anyway, another topic.
Right. All right. Well. So I guess we'll see, because that will still be developing by the time we talk next. The last story we were going to bring up today, this was one you wanted. I would have probably passed on this, but it is kind of fun because I get to talk about legal stuff. Is that Trump has the Trump companies, I should be more specific, have sued Deutsche Bank and oh my gosh,
Capital One.
The other bank, Capital One. In an effort to prevent them from responding to a subpoena for various business records of the Trump organization. So I'll ask you first. I mean, why? To me, this story seems sort of it's kind of a garden variety, run of the mill sort of thing. But what does this mean to you? And do you see this as significant, or is it just kind of?
Well, to me, I think it's not. The specific thing isn't necessarily that significant, but the larger strategy, I think, is significant, or at least I think it's important to understand. Obviously, Donald Trump is no stranger to lawsuits on either side of them, right? In fact, I just got sent a book called Plaintiff in Chief about the history of Donald Trump's lawsuits. Maybe I'll have the author on to talk about that. But basically, from a strategic standpoint, I wanted to bring some, because it makes a lot of sense. And most legal experts on both sides of things seem to agree that there's really not much of a legal case here, that eventually the courts are going to say, well, no, this is legitimate congressional oversight and these things have to be turned over. But if you understand what the Trump administration is playing for, this is a perfectly, intelligible and smart strategy. Is basically just saying, can we hold this off until after 2020? Well, almost certainly yes. And so that's all they're really looking for. And I think they're going to lose on this, and most legal experts think they're going to lose on this, but at that point it's not going to matter, basically. And also this,
or the other thing is, can you negotiate it?
Some kind of a maybe. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Right. I don't think Congress is going to be the House is going to be very interested in doing that. But there's also the possibility, maybe they're thinking, hey, maybe, the economy's going well, things turn right in our direction. Maybe we take over the House again and then all this goes away, So it's a smart strategy, I would say, from a legal standpoint. But also, this goes to my thinking that, my theory that Donald Trump never expected to win the presidency. And he was, completely unprepared for all of this scrutiny that his crooked businesses would have, basically. And so now it's just, they knew that you can stop this stuff for years. And so, it's not really going to be a problem until probably 2021, 2022. And at that point, they can just say, well, what are you going to do? Impeach me? And at that point, I think, I think if he gets reelected, and at that point, I think Congress is not necessarily going to be all that interested in doing that, basically.
So, okay, I think you're mostly right on that. I think, although I would say this. I mean, as look, I'll tell you, in the last month, this has happened to me, say, 3 times. So not my records being, but it just in my job, this is a standard kind of thing that happens in litigation. Is you will subpoena records from a third party, and for the most part, the person who is the first party or second party, depending on how you're counting, does not have standing to object to a subpoena of records that somebody else has, right? Mm-hmm. But it is not uncommon for that party to jump in and say, well, hold on. In this case, we do have, some reason to object because these are confidential financial reports, and it would subject us to loss of confidential business information, trade secrets, yada, yada, yada. So we would move for a what's called a protective order, saying that the subpoena should not move forward. the banks should not have to turn over this material. So, to me, it's kind of pretty much run of the mill type stuff. And I think regardless whether you were the president or not the president or anybody in litigation, this is pretty much a standard move.
Sure. Yeah.
And I don't see like it's not a to I'm trying to think. Some of the Democrats said this is a completely, outlandish, unprecedented step. Abusing the courts to try to. No, it's not. This is sort of a standard thing that every company would do. Every litigant would do.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. And obviously, the reason why this hasn't come up in presidential context is that most presidents, release their, a lot of their financial history and divest themselves and put things in blind trust. And Donald Trump decided he wasn't going to do that, and so he opened himself up to all of these things, basically.
Right.
I mean, I think he was operating on the theory, like, well, now that I've won the presidency, this could be great for business. So, hey, because again, it's the fundamental crookedness of this man, I would argue. But one last point I wanted to make on this, Jay, is some people are talking about how this might play into what Democrats are thinking about impeachment. Of course, one of the charges against Nixon was contempt of Congress. And, this could play out to that point. And there's this conventional wisdom that if the Democrats move ahead with impeachment proceedings, even if they can get a majority in the House, which at this point I think is questionable, and certainly it won't pass, it won't go through the Senate, he won't be convicted. But there's this idea that even if they start the process, it will hurt Democrats. And they say, well, see, look at how it hurt Republicans when they did the same thing to Clinton. But if you look at that history, the Clinton impeachment happened in December of 1998. What happened right after that? Well, the Republicans won the presidency in 2000. They only lost 2 House seats, and they kept the majority, and they only lost 1 Senate seat. So I guess I'm saying is we should be maybe not quite so quick to assume that impeachment is going to be this deadly, awful thing for the Democrats. Now, the situation here is a little different, obviously, because that impeachment happened after Clinton was reelected. Yeah, exactly. Yes. So now if you're being really Machiavellian, then you say, well, then the thing to do is just wait and see if Trump is reelected. And if he is, then go ahead and impeach him. Now, that would, there are some issues with that. But, I just think it's important to keep in mind that, we're not sure exactly how this would affect Democrats, and this idea that it just really killed the Republicans is just simply, I think, a highly questionable idea.
Well, first of all, I'd say I'm glad you're recognizing that, because that's sort of been a Democrat talking point for 2 decades now, that the impeachment of Bill Clinton was a horrible tactical mistake, and look at those stupid Republicans. That said, I mean, I'm going to go back on the record. I think I said this last November. The House Democrats will impeach President Trump.
Okay, I am
no doubt in my mind.
I am willing to say that while there will definitely be some momentum for it, it's not going to get to that point. Pelosi is going to make sure that doesn't happen because she sees it as a political loser. So we are both now on record, and hopefully when it happens or doesn't happen, someone will remind us, and one of us will be able to crow happily. If we want to do that sort of thing. Not that we'd rub anyone. I wouldn't rub. I certainly won't rub your nose in it. I mean, I'm used to being right, and I know you wouldn't do that either. Anyway, so that pretty much does it for this week, doesn't it, Jay?
I think so.
Yeah, but before we do go, one final thing. Right now we're kind of in a transition phase with the politics guys, kind of our gawky teen years, maybe. I don't know, something like that. We're trying to find a model that will allow us to keep the podcast going through the 2020 elections, and through long after that, into a Hickenlooper second term, is my thinking. But now this isn't the start of a funding pitch, I promise. But a key part of every strategy we're considering involves growing our listener base. And you may have heard we've been running a few ads in various places, but of course, ads don't come close to having the impact that your personal recommendation does. So if you could share this episode right now, or, maybe wait a minute until after I shut up, with friends and followers, nemesis, whatever, coworkers, on whatever social media networks you're on, and email, what have you, that would not only...
Dark web.
Yeah, dark web. There you go. That would be great. Reddit, whatever. It really helps, because you hear ads, we hear ads, and we're like, oh yeah, whatever, someone's paying to say that. But if you tell people that you know that we're worth watching, listening to, that's going to mean so much more, and we'd really appreciate it. Also, if you do that on Twitter, include our Twitter handle, that's at Politics Guys, or Facebook, Politics Guys page. We'll be able to see whatever message you include with your sharing of that. And I know, Jay, you know too, we have some very creative listeners. I'm betting people come up with some really interesting messages, and it might be a lot of fun to see those. Maybe even, I don't know, read some of them on the air in a future episode. So we would really appreciate if you could do that. All right, but that does it for this episode. Hey, if you want to get in touch with us, mail at politicsguys.com. And there is our Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page. We have some very interesting and pretty involved discussions throughout the week on that. And we're also on Twitter at Politics Guys. And if you do want to support the show financially, patreon.com/politicsguys or politicsguys.com/support. And if you do support the show, you get access to all kinds of interesting stuff, like, for instance, our supporters exclusive bonus show, which Jay and I are going to be recording right after we're done with this. This week, I think it's infrastructure and emoluments. That's always a word I have trouble with, Jay. I don't know why. It's one of those
Same here.
weird things. But yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about both those. And again, that's one of the many possibilities that you can get if you are a Politics Guys supporter. And to find out all about that, we've got levels and things, so it's all kinds of stuff. Just go to patreon.com/politicsguys and you can learn all about it. Thank you so much for your support. The executive producers of Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, and Benji Fishman. Today's show is produced by Jay Carson and Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you join us.